From Gideon's earliest appearance, the story framed him as a figure positioned to embody the remnants of imperial authority. Yet a closer examination reveals that his influence within the galaxy was limited by structural constraints that the narrative occasionally obscured for dramatic effect. The opening sequences that introduced him relied heavily on presentation rather than substantiated power, creating an image of importance derived from symbolism rather than meaningful strategic capability. This integrated cinematic introduction establishes a foundation for analysing how Gideon's perceived authority diverged from the practical realities that governed his position within the fractured post-war landscape. The design of Gideon's armour, vehicles and military assets conveyed an impression of technological superiority, but these components were not part of a broad, institutional apparatus. In the context of the imperial hierarchy, equipment such as advanced troopers or specialised weaponry typically reflected system-wide manufacturing and distribution pipelines, yet Gideon's resources appeared isolated from such networks. Their existence depended on limited access to leftover facilities, rather than on coordinated imperial supply chains. This distinction indicates that Gideon's power base did not originate from the infrastructure that once supported figures like Tarkin, but from remnants assembled piecemeal following the Empire's collapse. Symbolic items associated with Gideon further illustrate the gap between image and influence. The Darksaber functioned as a cultural artifact with historical significance among Mandalorian factions, yet its narrative purpose for Gideon relied on appropriation rather than earned authority. Owning such an artifact did not inherently confer legitimacy within Mandalorian society, nor did it grant the strategic insight needed to influence their internal politics. Instead, Gideon leveraged the device to project authority externally, using the visual presence of a revered object as a substitute for substantive influence. This reliance on symbolism demonstrates his dependence on borrowed narratives to project an illusion of power. The structure of Gideon's forces also reflects limits in his actual control. Unlike established imperial leaders who commanded large formations with clear chains of command, Gideon's troops included experimental units, repurposed droids, and personnel assembled from fragmented imperial remnants. These components created operational capacity, yet they lacked the institutional cohesion found in traditional imperial armies. Without standardized training protocols, sector-wide coordination, or logistical support, these forces functioned more as isolated cohorts rather than as components of a unified military structure. Their dependence on Gideon's personal direction further highlights the absence of a governing system that could maintain discipline independent of his immediate oversight. Examining Gideon's interactions with protagonists reveals additional constraints on his effectiveness. Throughout various encounters, his maneuvers largely consisted of reactionary measures rather than preemptive strategies. When confronted with unexpected developments, Gideon's responses tended to follow linear patterns rather than adaptive sequences. He deployed troops to intercept threats, attempted containment, and relied on delaying tactics. Yet these decisions did not reflect extensive predictive planning. The absence of multi-stage operational frameworks indicates that his strategic scope remained narrow, driven by situational pressure rather than by a broad evaluation of future contingencies. The environments in which Gideon operated further restricted his influence. Unlike high-ranking imperial officials who exercised authority across multiple sectors, Gideon's operations remained geographically confined. His bases, supply points, and military presence were concentrated in isolated regions that lacked strategic depth. These locations did not offer diverse routes of reinforcement or fallback positions. As a result, Gideon could not coordinate operations across wide territories or leverage geographically distributed assets. This lack of territorial reach reinforced the limited scale of his campaigns and emphasized the localized nature of his influence within the broader galactic context. Gideon's attempts to manipulate Mandalorian affairs reveal another dimension of his constrained authority. Historical precedent shows that successful manipulation of Mandalorian politics requires understanding of cultural doctrines, clan dynamics, and historical grievances. Gideon's approach relied instead on coercion and symbolic displays, such as leveraging the Darksaber, without engaging with the political complexities that define Mandalorian governance. His reliance on force and intimidation, rather than on informed engagement with Mandalorian structures, restricted his ability to influence long-term outcomes and further demonstrated the superficial nature of his authority within their socio-political sphere. The operational goals associated with Gideon's actions exhibit additional limitations. His pursuit of Grogu, his interest in experimental military assets, and his attempts to maintain control of confined regions did not reflect a coherent, long-term, strategic framework. These pursuits aligned more closely with personal motives or isolated tactical objectives than with a comprehensive plan designed to alter galactic power dynamics. Without alignment to broader political or military aims, Gideon's operations did not meaningfully impact the balance of power between major factions, indicating the narrow scope of his ambitions and the minimal strategic significance of his campaigns. Evidence from interactions among remnant leadership further clarifies Gideon's secondary position. Groups engaged in coordinated planning demonstrated access to strategic intelligence, financial capital, and manufacturing capacity that exceeded anything Gideon controlled. Their discussions, decision-making processes, and operational directives displayed a level of organizational sophistication absent from Gideon's endeavors. These collectives evaluated macro-level threats, assessed the viability of successor regimes, and developed projects with implications extending across multiple sectors. In contrast, Gideon remained focused on territorial possession and technological experimentation, operating without the institutional backing required to influence galactic outcomes. This disparity highlights why Gideon functioned as a contained obstacle rather than a defining adversary. The evolution of the New Republic provides additional insight into why Gideon's impact remained limited. The New Republic's early governance model relied on decentralized authority, reduced military presence, and reliance on local systems to maintain stability. This structure created vulnerabilities that Gideon exploited temporarily, yet his actions primarily revealed institutional weaknesses rather than posing existential threats. When Gideon disrupted operations or captured strategic assets, the New Republic's response exposed gaps in communication, delayed mobilization, and inconsistent enforcement across regions. These shortcomings reflected systemic issues rather than Gideon's skill, positioning him as a diagnostic indicator of governance challenges rather than as a critical force capable of altering political direction. Gideon's attempts to shape Mandalorian affairs similarly reveal the limits of his influence. The internal dynamics of Mandalorian culture involve historical divisions, clan-based authority, and decentralized leadership structures that have persisted across generations. Gideon's role in their conflicts did not reshape these dynamics, but instead acted as a catalyst that revealed underlying fractures. His actions created conflict scenarios that exposed the consequences of unresolved disputes, prompting Mandalorian factions to confront long-standing divisions. However, Gideon lacked the cultural understanding or sustained influence needed to alter the trajectory of their political evolution. His presence accelerated developments already in motion, rather than directing them through strategic insight. The scientific elements associated with Gideon's operations provide further evidence of his narrative function as a precursor rather than a principal architect. His interest in experimental research, cloning, and advanced technologies aligned superficially with broader remnant initiatives, yet his efforts lack the scale, precision, and institutional oversight characteristic of more influential programs operating elsewhere. These larger initiatives involved coordinated resource allocation, specialized scientific personnel, and multi-phase planning that exceeded Gideon's capabilities. His research functioned as a localized expression of broader scientific ambitions, rather than as a central pillar of long-term remnant strategy, indicating that he participated in a fragment of a system whose most consequential work continued independently of him. Additionally, Gideon's defeats illustrate that his presence served to unify or mobilize groups whose internal cohesion needed narrative reinforcement. When Mandalorian factions confronted his forces, the conflict required them to cooperate in ways that addressed previous fragmentation. This cooperation revealed that Gideon's role centered on creating conditions that required collective action rather than posing a threat capable of overcoming such unity. His defeat signified not the removal of a dominant power, but the resolution of a coordination challenge that the narrative needed to address. Gideon facilitated this process by providing a focal point for conflict without possessing the structural strength to resist the consequences of unified opposition. The trajectory of imperial succession further contextualizes why Gideon's role remained secondary. As remnants reorganized, key leadership figures pursued initiatives aimed at rebuilding influence through strategic consolidation rather than through regional dominance. Their priorities included establishing new military frameworks, developing ideological cohesion, and harnessing advanced technologies to support successor movements. Gideon's approach lacked this systemic perspective, resulting in a narrow vision focused on immediate gains rather than long-term restructuring. His operational goals placed him outside the core strategic developments shaping the future of imperial-aligned factions, reducing his long-term relevance within the broader post-war narrative. In examining Gideon's narrative function, it becomes clear that his most important contribution lies in his ability to highlight the limitations of superficial authority. By emphasizing presentation over institutional depth, Gideon demonstrated how remnants of the empire could appear formidable while lacking the infrastructure required for sustained influence. His failures provided contrast to factions that operated with greater cohesion and long-term planning, clarifying which groups possessed the capacity to influence future events. Through this contrast, the story illustrated the difference between localized aggression and systemic power, showing that Gideon represented the former while the latter continued developing beyond the boundaries of his influence. Ultimately, Gideon's presence signals that the post-imperial galaxy cannot be understood through isolated figures whose authority depends on force or theatrics. The forces that shape the era stem from structural changes, ideological movements, and coordinated initiatives that operate across multiple regions and organizations. Gideon functioned as a narrative mechanism that exposed vulnerabilities, revealed underlying tensions, and accelerated developments already in progress. But he did not possess the capability to alter the galaxy's trajectory. His role underscores that the true drivers of post-war transformation were large-scale processes unfolding beyond his control, demonstrating that Gideon was never intended to be the central threat, but rather a localized figure whose limited authority illuminated the emergence
Thank you
of
for
more
watching.
consequential
Be sure to
powers.
like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.